We are here with Alex Avina, professor of history at Arizona State University, as well as contributor to the Foreign Exchanges newsletter. I want to start by saying thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Of course, and I'm very excited to discuss the historic elections in Mexico with them electing Claudia Sheinbaum, the first woman president in North America, as well as the first Jewish president who also ran on a pretty left-leaning platform. I want to start by just asking your overall thoughts on the results of the election.
I think you framed it correctly. It's a historic election in many different ways. I know U.S. media really focused on President-elect Claudia Sheinbaum's identity as the first woman and first Jewish president of Mexico. Those are historic firsts in in Mexican history, and they're important in a variety of ways beyond just symbolic, I think. Um, but also the actual results of the elections were historic in the sense that we've never seen this type of democratic mandate given to one particular presidential candidate and the political coalition that they're leading. So Sheinbaum ended up winning like 61% of the vote. Her nearest opponent, Xochitl Galvez from a rival political coalition, got like 28%. So, I mean, it wasn't even close. It's more than 30%. And the congressional and gubernatorial elections were had a similar like blowout quality to them as well. So this is unprecedented. This is a bigger mandate than what current president Andrés Manuel López Obrador gained in the 2018 elections. So we're in an unprecedented moment in Mexican history, and we'll see what happens. There's also going to be another unprecedented moment in September when the new Congress takes their seats. But President Sheinbaum will not take office until October 1st. So you're gonna have a month of a new Congress with an essential supermajority for the current president of Mexico, and you'll have like a month to work with this new Congress, right? And it one of the goals of the political coalition that's called "Let's Keep Making History," and it involves the Morena party that Andrés Manuel López Obrador helped found, has two smaller parties that are in the coalition: the Labor Party and the Green Party. They have a really ambitious 20-point reform package, but to implement a lot of these constitutional changes, they needed a supermajority in Congress, and it looks like they have it. So that's also going to be really unprecedented to watch.
That sounds like some very exciting stuff coming in the future. Before we jump into the specifics of her platform and maybe some of the issues or goals that she might have, for those who don't know, maybe or aren't as aware, could you briefly lay out like the structure of politics in Mexico? I know it differs in some parts, like how long does the president serve when they're elected, what kind of control they have, just those sorts of things.
Yeah, for sure. So, without that's a dangerous question to ask a historian, but so Mexican presidents can only serve one 6-year term, and there's historical reasons for that. Um, there was one political party, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or the PRI, that ruled Mexico for close to 7 decades throughout most of the 20th century after this big social revolution happened in Mexico in 1910. So in beginning in the late 70s that they started to implement some piecemeal democratic reforms, but you didn't have another political party contest the presidency until the year 2000, with the right-wing PAN party managed to dislodge the PRI after 7-8 decades in power. Mexico's Congress is a bicameral Congress, so there's like their version of the House of Representatives has 500 seats. And the Senate, they have a Senate that has 128 seats. Not all of those seats are gained through direct election. Some of those are proportional. They're distributed based on how your party does proportionally during the election. So some seats are set aside for that mechanism. And there's also efforts to achieve gender parity in Mexican Congress. So like institutionalized rules that deal with gender parity in the Mexican Congress. There's elections every 3 years elections are set either every 3 years to every 6 years. The congressional elections every 3 years and gubernatorial elections, and then every 6 years you have a combination of all three. And this is why this last round that happened in June was like they were the biggest elections in Mexican history in terms of the number of seats at all levels, from the municipal to the state to the federal. It was tens of thousands. So it was a massive election. So that's kind of like a basic quick rundown of the political system.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate that. Jumping back to the newly elected president, could you speak to maybe some of like the platform that she ran on? How much does she like differ or overlap from the previous president, AMLO, I believe? And what was kind of her main messaging that got her elected?
I mean, this is an open question, right? I think, one of the I think most plausible explanations for why she won such a huge victory, electoral victory, is that she promised a continuation of the policies that had been implemented by the current president, as he's known, AMLO with the acronym, when that he implemented after he was elected in 2018. So when AMLO was elected in 2018, he had run for president three previous times, if I remember correctly. No, two or three, I can't remember. Um, but when he finally wins in 2018, he represented his victory and the victory of his Morena party as a fourth transformation in Mexican history. So not only did he win an electoral victory, he cast this as like a historic level achievement. The first transformation refers to Mexican independence. The second refers to these civil wars between liberals and conservatives in the late 19th century. The third transformation was that revolution of 1910 that I referenced earlier. So he then decided to frame his election in 2018 as this fourth momentous moment in modern Mexican history. And he's elected really as the first leftist as in Mexican history. At least is how he positioned himself. There's questions over whether he really is a leftist or not. There's
Mhm.
similar questions about President-elect Sheinbaum. But he did things like, implement really popular social welfare programs like direct cash transfer programs to a variety of different groups in Mexican society. I think something like seven to eight out of every 10 Mexican families is impacted by these cash transfer programs, scholarship programs. They raised the minimum wage for the first time in a meaningful way that outpaced inflation and to the highest level since the late 70s. So there's the economic explanation as to why he was so popular, and then that popularity extended over to President-elect Sheinbaum when she ran on the platform of not only I am the successor of AMLO, I'm not only going to continue the very popular socioeconomic programs that he implemented, but I'm actually going to enshrine them in the Mexican Constitution as part of this broad reform package that they will try to implement when we get to September of later this year. There's also just the factor that the political opposition in Mexico has thoroughly discredited itself. Um, the political coalition included the PRI that I mentioned already, the PAN party that ruled Mexico at the presidential level from 2000 to 2012, and then a smaller center left or a center left party called the PRD. They have a really important role to play in the democratization of Mexican history, but in the last 6 or 7 years, they've kind of, in many ways, they've kind of sold out. And AMLO actually came from that party, and same with President-elect Sheinbaum. And then they bolted when Morena was founded in the early 2010s. So there really is no plausible political coalition in Mexico. You have this weird assortment of these three political parties that used to be rivals. They used to hate each other. They're ideologically not similar. But this was kind of like a last gasp effort to try to mitigate, to try to undercut the popularity of Morena and President AMLO, and it failed thoroughly. And I think that's another reason why we had such a huge electoral victory. There simply is no plausible political opposition, and since the election, they haven't done themselves any favors. If you're fluent in Spanish and you want to jump on social media, you should see some of the reactions. It's some classist reactions, some racist reactions, the lack of self-reflection. There's one trend that I saw online where people are like, I'm not going to give charity to poor people anymore because they voted for Morena. So that it's going to be interesting to see like what emerges as a plausible political opposition to Morena in the next 6 years.
And you spoke to some of the opposition parties kind of discrediting themselves. I'm curious, how much was it kind of, or Morena and AMLO be credited for shifting the demographics in Mexico to being more receptive to this sort of political messaging, where it seems they're more worker forward, maybe welfare forward, if that's the right word, I'm not sure. Or how much was it
Yeah.
maybe Mexico had the stomach for it from these parties largely discrediting themselves?
No, that's a great question. I mean, I think that also, one of the things that happened during the AMLO presidency is you did start to see a demographic shift in his base of support to a much more class-based. So you do see now, well, toward the end of his presidency, you did see a shift to a worker, a working class base of support or working poor base of support for his political project and his program. When he's elected in 2018, his the demographics of his support cut across classes. But during his presidency, some of his policies, a lot of this has to do with his political style, helped create, it helped reinsert class as a point of cleavage, to borrow from political scientist Edwin Ackerman, who's at Syracuse, who's written about this. And again, some of this has to do with the socioeconomic reforms and programs that have benefited the Mexican working class. Although there's also a lot of debate about that within the Mexican left. But at least the way most Mexicans interpreted these programs, they see it as something that's been beneficial. So toward the end, by the end of AMLO's presidency, you do see a base of support that's much more working class. But then again, it's just such, like, it's a huge, like, 61% of voters voted for Sheinbaum, so it's like everyone voted. She won 31 out of 32 states. She lost one state. She only lost, I think it was like 5 to 6 electoral districts throughout the country, and in those districts, it was mostly people who lived in like the highest percentile of economic wealth.
Mhm.
So there's debates within the Mexican left about how leftist AMLO's political project is, and how leftist this political platform that Sheinbaum has announced. So, I mean, there's a lot of debate, but nonetheless, we can't deny it. There's been a massive shift, class-based form of support and shift toward Morena and this political project that will now be carried forward later this year by Sheinbaum.
Yeah, and I was getting ready for this, I was watching your interview with the Majority Report, and I don't want to mistake your position, so feel free to correct me if I was wrong, but one of the things I believe you mentioned had maybe being a little disappointed with Mexico's border policy or enforcement with respect to America, and how you hope Sheinbaum or President-elect Sheinbaum could reform that. Could you speak maybe to some of those issues and what you hope she could do differently?
Yeah, sure. No, I think you stated what I mentioned accurately. I think so. Uh, One issue that I hope she does depart from current President AMLO is the border issue. We've seen in the last 3 to 4 months, we've seen a massive drop in the number of quote unquote encounters that Border Patrol has had with migrants and refugees at the U.S. Mexico border. And that's because Mexico has implemented a policy to wear out migrants and to prevent them from getting to the US Mexico border. So they've implemented military and police checkpoints throughout a lot of the country, particularly on routes that they know migrants will use to try to get to the US Mexico border. So migrants haven't gone away. They've just been prevented from getting to the US Mexico border. And that speaks to a particular US Mexico relationship that is, at least from the US perspective, is bipartisan, right? Like, it cuts across political party lines. If there's one issue other than foreign policy that demonstrates a bipartisan consensus in the US, is the question of migration and so-called border security. And Mexico's it's acting as some sort of colonial border police for the United States. Now, in return, what do they get? There's a lot of speculation about what AMLO received from Trump and now Biden in terms of acting like a colonial border police for the US. And one of the hypotheses is that he'd be allowed to do whatever he wants to do internally within Mexico. That's one of there's no actual factual evidence for that argument, but that essentially the U.S. would respect Mexican sovereignty, particularly when it came to socioeconomic matters, if Mexico in turn worked as like border patrol for the U.S. I hope that Sheinbaum rethinks that policy. I think Mexico can do a lot of good work in pressuring the U.S. to shift what I think is a lethal, murderous approach to refugee and asylum seekers. And we'll see. We'll see. It remains to be seen. But Mexico has a lot of leverage. For one, economically, the U.S. and Mexico are so thoroughly intertwined that that gives Mexico a lot of leverage, even though it's obviously like a lesser in terms of power, it's lesser than the United States. And one way to do this is, and I think AMLO tried to do this at least rhetorically, like, and who he was speaking to in terms of audience was kind of a question, but he would say things like, we need $20 billion a year that the US should be investing in Central American and Caribbean nations to kind of get at the root causes of migration. he also would always make a point of saying, look, we need to get rid of the U.S. sanctions regimes against Venezuela and Cuba. It's like a vast majority of refugees and migrants have come from those two countries. Whether he was serious about that or how seriously he was pushing that within internal conversations with the U.S. and with the Biden administration, we don't know. But that's like a good idea, actually. Like we
Okay.
need to get beyond enforcement and carceral approaches to migration to get at the root causes. And a lot of those root causes have to do with the U.S. position as an empire within the Americas. The other main issue, and this is based on kind of some of the research that I do, is AMLO promised when he became president that he was going to have a different approach to the issue of drugs, right? And it gets called the abrazos no balazos approach, or in English, it's the hugs, not bullets. He never implemented that, even though U.S. media like fell for that head fake and continued to report as if AMLO was going around hugging narcos left and right. But in practice, he continued to rely on the Mexican military to use punitive lethal measures to deal with security in the countryside, security in the provinces. Um, and it hasn't had much of a dent in narco trafficking issues, right? And again, this is obviously a transnational issue because Mexico shares the border with the world's, what I think is the world's largest narco state, and it's also the world's largest arms state. So a lot of U.S. weapons are flowing into Mexico, and that's fueling a lot of the conflict between different drug trafficking and criminal organizations. So I hope, as I mentioned on the majority report, I hope Sheinbaum goes back to that earlier moment and seriously addresses the root causes of drug trafficking and organized crime in Mexico, instead of continuing to give more and more power to the Mexican military, which is something that's been happening in the last 6 years. And now the Mexican military has, they're politically subordinate, obviously still to civilian political leadership, but economically they've actually amassed quite a bit of power thanks to some of the reforms and policies of the AMLO presidency. But again, so I hope President-elect Sheinbaum goes back to that earlier moment to rethink this militarized approach to drugs. And again, this is a transnational issue. She's going to need help from the United States because this issue is thoroughly transnational.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head. One of the things when I talk about immigration, I always try to get in people's heads is if we stop sanctioning countries, migrants from those countries would stop coming as often. But we focus more on things that don't fix the symptoms, like we just want to build walls, like that's ever historically worked. And one of the things I wanted to bring up is I'm sure you're aware Biden's recent executive action that I frankly think is illegal. I mean, allowing the president to block asylum claims, something that's protected in U.S. law and international law. I'm kind of curious if you could maybe speak to Claudia's opinion with in accordance to like American relations on that. Is that something you think she might differ from AMLO on, or kind of stick with the same?
We see. I mean, I'm like wish casting, right? So I don't know. I mean, I hope she does, but that's going to be a huge issue, right? I think U.S.-Mexico relations are always a huge issue, even though from an American perspective, policymakers and U.S. government officials tend to overlook or take Mexico for granted, except in a moment of crisis, except when like something's framed as a crisis, and then all of a sudden we pay attention to Mexico. And but then as I wrote in a piece, I have a piece coming out with Foreign Exchanges where I talk about how when these same people look at Mexico, they use those sepia filter, right? Like in movies, when the movie shifts to like a Mexican context, like it looks yellow, it looks scary and ominous. So sometimes it's actually not good that the U.S. is paying attention to Mexico if that's going to be their framing. But this is going to be one of the biggest things that she has to deal with. And again, I hope she uses a little bit of Mexico's leverage as a border, as sharing a border with the United States to push through a more reasonable, a more sensible approach to migration, right? Like, yeah, it should be obvious at this point that we should stop sanctioning countries these sanctions that produce refugees and asylum seekers to prevent them from coming to the United States. I mean, I think something that I've come to think about more and more as someone who like is very passionate and writes about questions of migration is that people not only have a right to come per U.S. and international law, but they also have a right to stay home. No one, like very few people are willing to go through these, like willingly willing to go through this like dangerous, life risking movement journey, right? Like no one wants to leave their home. Like my parents were migrants. Like they didn't want to come to the United States because they wanted to. They came here because there was economic opportunity, because they wanted to give their kids a better shot at life. but they always miss home. Like for them, home is always in Mexico, right? So we need to think about, you know, not what can we do to enshrine and protect people's right to stay home, to stay with their communities, to stay with their loved ones, free of violence, free of economic, you know, all forms of violence, political, military, economic violence that in many cases is generated by the foreign policy of the United States, in the Caribbean and throughout Latin America.
And another place that I was wondering if Claudia Sheinbaum might differ a little bit from AMLO, as I know he was a bit more maybe old school, old fashioned when it came to environmental things, at least with oil and stuff. And I believe Sheinbaum was a climate scientist in her past. Has she spoke to, or is there any kind of maybe indicators that she might differ from him in climate things?
I mean, I think many people are hoping that her background as an environmental scientist, she was part of a Nobel Prize winning commission, I think from 2020, 2021. Um, but we'll see, man. Like it remains to be seen. She does seem to have a different approach to fossil fuels. Um, but dealing with the state-owned oil company in Mexico, Pemex, she's gonna have to be really creative, right? Because right now, it's that company is Mexico has had declining oil production for more than a decade. So the state oil company, they've been pumping billions into the state oil company. It has massive amounts of debt. So and AMLO, one of AMLO's approaches to the state oil company was to continue, you know, dumping money into it. So we'll see if Sheinbaum continues that. I mean, I think one of AMLO's big mega projects was to build this like refinery in his home state of Tabasco that, to my knowledge, has yet to really produce any barrels of refined oil. But you know, hopefully she will move away from these type of mega projects that have a negative environmental or ecological impact. But I don't see anything that evidences that, right? Like where I think a lot of us are hoping that her background and her training are allowing her to see why we should be, you know, thinking about alternate forms of energy. I think one of the things that can't, I think one of the good things that AMLO did is to talk about, you know, energy sovereignty. And I think that's a legit point, right? Like, how can a country develop its own alternative sources of energy, but have it remain within the sovereign ownership of the nation and the peoples of that nation for them to benefit, right, from it, not just transnational corporations? So that's a legitimate, important question. Can they do that with green forms of energy production, right? Can they, AMLO nationalize lithium? That's also not like some panacea, right? Mining lithium is going to have negative ecological consequences as well, particularly in northern Mexico. But it would be really interesting to see a discussion on so-called green forms of energy, but within the confines of energy sovereignty, and the benefits of that accruing to for the benefit of all Mexicans and not just for the benefit of an elite few, whether they're domestic or foreign investors. But again, we haven't seen like we haven't seen like material evidence that this is something that she's going to do.
Yeah, awesome. I kind of want to end by actually looking forward. What kind of impact do you think that this election will have on elections to come, from the multitude of ways it's been historic, from, as you said, the significant amount of the vote she got, her just being the first female and first Jewish president? I'm curious how you think this might shape elections in the future, from how people run, turnout, just what kind of effect do you think it'll have?
Yeah, that's a big question. Well, from the position of the political opposition in Mexico and some, uh, let's say the commentariat, I mean, they're freaked out right now because they're saying that this is going to lead to that too much democracy is going to lead to undemocratic forms of government, right? Because the Sheinbaum and Morena and their two small little junior political parties won such an overwhelming victory, that this is going to lead to the reconsolidation of a hegemonic political party, something akin to what existed in Mexico from the late 20s up until the year 2000. So there's a lot of like apocalyptic, doom casting coming from certain sectors of the Mexican commentariat, and definitely from the political opposition. Um, the I from turning that around a little bit, I do think that they Morena and Sheinbaum have a huge responsibility with this massive democratic mandate, right? Like, what are you going to do with it? How are you going to continue to improve the everyday lives and of working class and working Mexicans, right? Because there are like looming public deficits. There's a question of Pemex. Like, there's economically, there's some signs that that the country might be heading toward a difficult time. I mean, the market definitely did not like this victory, right? Like the day after the electoral results came in, the Mexican peso plunged, the Mexican stock market plunged, all the bonds plunged, with the exception of the Pemex one for some reason, right? So that's another, like, you have this ambitious reform package. How are you going to calibrate or balance that with external disciplinary mechanisms that are coming from foreign capital or from the United States? I think that's going to be something huge to see. But I think the biggest thing for me is to see you have this big overwhelming democratic mandate. Now, what are you going to do with it? And I think the current president AMLO, wasted a lot of time engaged in stupid fights because that's part of his style. He's very combative, right? That's part of his style.
Mhm.
Like I hope Sheinbaum maybe takes it in a much more productive direction, and uses this democratic mandate to continue improving the lives of everyday Mexicans. But we'll see. We'll see how this impacts future elections. We'll see how whether Morena continues to capture the vast majority of working class support and lower class support. You may continue to see a class polarization. Probably that's what I've seen in the last couple of weeks. You have seen some pretty hysterical assessments coming from elite Mexicans. Just jump on Twitter, and again, if you're fluent in Spanish or hit that translate button, you're gonna see some amazing takes. But that's my main thing. My main thing is you have this huge democratic mandate. What are you going to do with it? And will it improve the everyday lives of Mexicans? The
I guess
majority
it's
of Mexicans.
the age old adage, only time will tell, right?
Yeah. And it's the worst thing you can ask a historian is to make predictions about the future, right? So,
Forget
but again,
history. We're talking
yeah.
about the future.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but again, these are unprecedented times. And again, to reiterate this, they have this mass democratic mandate that we haven't seen before. The closest thing we had seen was in 2018, but then this is a bigger one. So, what is President-elect Sheinbaum and Morena and the Morena coalition going to do with it? I think it's going to be one of the big questions to keep following.
Awesome. Well, I want to say again, thank you for joining us and taking time answering my questions. It's been a blast talking to you and learning a bit about the political structure and elections going on in Mexico.
Thank you so much. This was
Yep.
great.
And
Anytime.
yep, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.